Welcome to A Better Divorce podcast, where we have conversations about the emotional, financial, and legal issues that are on your mind or should be on your radar if your goal is to keep your divorce out of court. I'm collaborative divorce attorney and mediator Andrea Vacca, and I know that how you divorce matters to your long-term well-being. That's why it's my mission to help you have a better divorce with as little acrimony as possible, so that you can create the best life possible on the other side of your marriage. Hi, I'm so happy to welcome Sarah Armstrong to the Better Divorce podcast today. Sarah is a good divorce proponent and the author of A Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce, What to Think Through When Children Are Involved. She has been through it and she's here to talk about it. So, Sarah, welcome to a Better Divorce podcast.
Great to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
So, what inspired you to write The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce? Why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I actually got divorced about 14 years ago when my daughter was 7 years old. And I was actually the first of my friends to go through the process. And once I went through it over the course of time, over the course of 5 years after my divorce, I had a number of friends who came to me and said, would you help me think through this because you had such a quote unquote good divorce? And it's interesting because I had not really thought about it that way, but I said, okay, well, I'll help you think through things. And I should start by saying, I'm not an advocate for divorce. I think ideally couples that get married stay married for the long term. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not the case. And these days, divorce is more common than ever. And so I went through the process and through the reflections my friends asked me to share with them, they said, someday you should write all this stuff down. And I said, well, I'm not a writer. I'm actually in the global marketing, corporate world. And so I was actually at a business dinner in Latin America with a group of colleagues, and a good friend of mine and colleagues turned to me and goes, Sarah, you're so happy. And I said, yeah. He said, but you're divorced. And I said, well, getting divorced isn't a death sentence. My ex-husband and I decided to no longer be married to each other. I'm happy, my daughter's happy, my ex-husband's happy. It is possible to be divorced and to be happy. And so I mentioned to him that some of my friends were encouraging me to write down my guidance. And he said, you really should. So the next morning I got on the plane out of Mexico City, opened my personal laptop and started writing. And I wrote the first line. I said, this book is written by a girl who never ever thought she would get a divorce, who got a divorce and what she learned along the way. And so that's what started it. And I joked that I wrote about 90% of the book on Delta as I traveled the world. When I was finished with my work, on a long haul flight, instead of watching a movie or reading a book, I would write my book.
Yeah, those long haul flights are good for that, right?
Yeah, they're so good. I don't know what it is at 30,000 feet, I think very clearly.
I know, I do too, actually. I'm always working on planes. It's just free time,
Exactly, and no interruptions. It's amazing. No.
It's amazing. So what was it that people were telling you had a good divorce? What does a good divorce look like? What does that mean?
Well, it's interesting. Grace, actually, my daughter defined it for me, and then I put some further definition around it. But when she was 8, about a year after our divorce, we were standing in the CVS checking out, and there was a People magazine on the newsstand, and there was a celebrity couple that was getting a divorce. And she said to me, Mommy, is that a good divorce or a bad divorce? And I said, Grace, I don't know. What's the difference between a good divorce and a bad divorce? She goes, well, good divorce is when the mommy and daddy are nice to each other like you and daddy. And a bad divorce is when they scream and yell at each other. And, I walked out of that CVS that night. I thought, whatever we were doing, that a year after we had literally changed Grace's life so significantly that she could refer to our divorce as a good divorce, I thought we were doing something right. So if I were to define it, I would say that a good divorce is when couples set aside the emotions they have for each other, and they put their children first. Right. And they keep them front and center through the process and afterwards, that what is best for your children. And ultimately, if you do that, I do think it's an attainable outcome to have a good divorce.
Yeah, so that's how, when you can look backwards and say, have I had a good divorce? Where am I now? Where have we ended up? But what does it take during the process? How do you know if you're on the track for a good divorce? Because it's about the process as well as the outcome, right?
It is. It is. And, I generally say that it starts with mindset. I think you have to come in with a mindset of positive intent of getting through the process with as little collateral damage as possible. Okay, both for yourself, but quite honestly for your children, because this will be something that, depending on how you approach it and the mindset you take and the actions and the approach you take to the emotional roller coaster that you're on through a divorce, can really define the overall impression that your children have of this process, and that you take with you, and that others around you take of like how you've approached this. So I do think mindset is essential. Yeah. And one of the things I do talk about in my book is a concept of having a compartmentalization muscle. Mm-hmm. Because it is, as I mentioned, such an emotional process, and you have to decide for the discussions you're having and the decisions you need to make, are you in the right mindset emotionally to make those decisions? So should you make that decision now, or should you set it aside until you're in the right mindset and you have the right, mental strength to make those decisions the way you need to? And so having that compartmentalization muscle, so that if your buttons are pushed, especially if it's in front of your children, do you react, or do you say, you know what, I'm going to react to that, just not right now. I'm going to take a long walk. I'm going to go and I can, call a friend, do whatever. But when your children are in your midst, really thinking about how you react in those moments is so important.
It's so true. I talk about mindset so much with our clients on this podcast, with everybody, because it starts there. And I love what you said in your book. You said sometimes, I'm paraphrasing, but sometimes you need to set your emotions aside so you can make decisions. And sometimes you need to set decisions aside so you can deal with your emotions.
Absolutely.
Right? You have to know the difference.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And honestly, I'm not saying that you should always just put your emotions internally and never deal with them. They need to come out. It's not healthy to put them just inside. That causes other issues. But yes, you have to decide where you are. And there are a lot of decisions to make during the divorce process, some that are short-term, but some that have long-term implications. And so your mental state and where you are emotionally in making those decisions really does have, short, midterm, and long-term impact on how you're going to live your life, how your children are going to live their lives. And so really being thoughtful about that, I think, is so important.
One of the big emotional decisions that women, in particular mothers, make are about housing. Some can be very attached to their homes, and they want to keep the home and want to keep the home for themselves, for their children, and it's so emotionally driven. And sometimes we say, or they want to move out and buy a new home right away.
Yes.
And very emotionally driven. And sometimes they have to stop and get the financial information you need. Think about what's driving this feeling. Can it be met in some other way? And really look at it long term as well as short term. So that's just a really good example, I think, of where mindset sometimes has to be, you have to put those decisions aside before and deal with the mindset issues first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's easy. I realize, Andrea, it's easier said than done.
Yes.
Right. This is not, by the way, most of what we're going to talk about, it's not easy. None of this is easy, but it is doable if you're thoughtful about it. And I think sometimes because we're in it and it's such an intense period of time, excuse me, that it can feel like you don't have the time to take the right approach, or feel like you have the time to take that deep breath and say, okay, is this the right time for me to make this decision? Is this the right time for me to have that discussion? And really just check yourself and see whether you think that it is the right time.
Right. And that's why the process you pick is so important if you're going to have a good divorce as well. Is it a process where you can have the time and space and support to think things through, or are you feeling under duress and being pushed? So talk a little about, I know you chose, you talk a lot about the process you chose and about how to pick a lawyer and so talk about a little bit about that. Like, what do you think goes into the early stages of setting yourself up for a good divorce?
Yeah, so I think first it's getting educated on the options. And so there are obviously various models and approaches to getting divorced. The more traditional approach, where each couple hires a lawyer, and again, depending on the type of lawyer you choose, it can set a tone for your divorce. We actually chose the collaborative divorce process, which I know you're involved with. And we were actually, I had not been exposed to that. And I should mention one thing because it's always important. I was raised by parents who've been married 55 years this summer. Amazing true partnership and marriage. And so they had an amazing marriage, but I did watch some fairly ugly divorces growing up amongst their friend group. And so I had a mental model of what divorce looked like from growing up. And I just knew I didn't want it to be that way. I thought there had to be a better way. So when we found the collaborative divorce process, it appealed to me because it was really focused, first of all, on what was best for Grace. Children are at the front and center of it. It also allowed each of us to have a coach that talked through the decisions that we needed to make in a conversation-based way to say, what is going to be best, and then bringing in the lawyers at the right time once you've made those decisions, and then having the child specialist and the financial neutral expert that could really talk to us from those angles. So that team-based approach really appealed to me. Now, some people will say to me, Andrea, wow, that sounds expensive. Lots of people. But actually, I found it to be very efficient. And because also you're investing in a coach, not a lawyer, for all those conversations at the outset. And so there is a different, obviously, compensation model there. But also, I just think that if you go in and you allow the structure that the collaborative process is designed to help you manage, it actually can move you through relatively quickly. And I say quickly, in air quotes, because I realize it's a process. But you can get through it in a timely manner to get to the other end of that process.
Knowing that, watching the clock ticking and knowing when you're emotionally having these conversations about how to communicate or how to manage your emotions or how not to get triggered or how to deal with concerns about your children, having somebody with expertise in that area, a mental health professional, a coach, oh my God, you're going to save so much money. So that was a misconception, I think a lot of people have or do have about the cost of the collaborative process, but it's great to hear you say that it really, you could see the benefit, the cost benefit analysis there that paying somebody who a much lower rate to get really the expertise you needed. That was
absolutely. And I've talked to numerous lawyers over the years that say, look, I'm here if you need me as your coach and your therapist, but I'm not really trained in either of those. I'm trained to be your lawyer and your attorney. So I think that's one of the things that I think also just being really conscious of what the roles that different individuals are meant to play in this process to allow you to get to the best outcome for you and your family.
And they also helped you. You had a child specialist in your collaborative divorce that helped you with the parenting plan and helping you figure out what's best for Grace, right? And how to logistically deal with all of that. So, can you talk about the benefit? What you got out of working with that specialist?
Yes. First of all, I think he was so essential to our entire divorce journey, I have to say. And one of the really poignant moments in our process was we actually met with him before we were going to tell Grace that we were getting a divorce. So he was going to coach us through some of those considerations. And we sat down, and my ex-husband, I sat down with him, and he looks at me and he says, Sarah, do you travel? And I said, yes, I travel internationally for my job. And he looked at my ex-husband and said, do you travel? He says, yes, I travel domestically. He said, well, Grace is about to become a professional traveler. She's going to travel every week for the next 11 years until she heads off to college. And honestly, Andrea, I burst into tears. And I thought, that is not what I want for Grace. That is not what I want for her life. And so we walked out of that session, and I said to my ex-husband, I want to do everything we can within our control to minimize the feeling of Grace feeling like she's a professional traveler. And so the goal I set for us, or we discussed, is minimizing the feeling of packing a bag every week.
Worst part of traveling.
Right. Continually packing and unpacking, right? It's constant. For those of us that travel a lot, it is literally a part of so much of our week. So what we did, and I do appreciate someone that says socioeconomic considerations, but we tried to have all the basics of both homes, the socks, the shorts, the, 2 pairs of running shoes, things that Grace could have kind of her life established at both homes, so that when she went to school, she just left with her backpack. She wasn't carrying the extra bag that was a signal that, her parents are divorced.
Right.
She has to go to dad's house tonight, or she has to go to mom's house tonight. that's an extra bag they have to carry every day, or a couple of times a week. And so that was something that we really felt strongly about doing for her, and we could do. Now, I do joke that, somehow on certain weeks, there were more socks at one house than another. I don't know how that happens. It literally, yeah. But what we would do is we would do rebalancing of the clothes. But it wasn't, by the way, Grace's job to rebalance her clothes. She didn't choose to live across two homes at age 7. So I would text my ex-husband and say, we need to do some rebalancing on Sunday. And whoever had the out of balance amount of clothes would go in and figure it out. And then we would hand those to the other parent.
Right.
Okay. And it's not for Grace to carry another bag of clothes and unpack another bag. I mean, she didn't choose this.
Yeah. Put your child in the middle of it and make sure that sweatshirt comes home with you, or, and I know parents aren't thinking what is that really doing to your child? But it sounds so mature and responsible. We made this choice. We need to deal with this, and we're going to make this as easy on our child as possible. Now, not everyone can have 2 of everything. I said that right off the bat. But what can you do? Even if you can't do that, maybe it's only limited to the shoes as opposed to all the T-shirts and underwear. I don't know, but
but just wherever you can do it, where the minimizing it. I said, it's minimizing it. And I do say, she had one pair of dress shoes. We weren't going to pair of Bible. So there were days, and I had, a moment where Grace came down one morning. She goes, "It's dress up day at school, and my dress up shoes are at Dad's house." And we're supposed to be walking out the door. And I had to take a moment and think, and take a deep breath, by the way, because we really didn't have time. And in fairness, my ex-husband and I lived about 10 minutes away from each other. But I'm thinking, I don't really have time to go get the dress shoes. But you know what? Again, it's not Grace's fault that she's living across 2 houses and keeping up with her dress. So I said, you know what? Let's go get your dress shoes. And so we were a little late for school. We went and got the dress shoes. And those are the moments when, again, it's not your child's fault. To get frustrated with them because their dress shoes aren't where they're supposed to be. So it's a constant thing of really keeping your kids in the forefront of what's best for them, even in moments when it's inconvenient for you.
And when you were making your parenting plan, and getting this good advice for how to keep her front and center, what else do you advise moms and dads to think about when they're coming to a parenting plan for the long-term view, when you're what did you find was helpful when you were negotiating these terms?
Yeah, it was interesting. I thought the concept of thinking not just about, the next couple of years, again, she was 7, but up until she was heading off to college, the decisions that we needed to make. And some of them I'm like, wow, that's 11 years away. I don't know, is this going to be the right decision? But we basically put a stake in the ground that we could always move if we thought we needed to. But we at least at that point made decisions of, how we would want to fund her college. When she got her driver's license, what would we do about a car? Excuse me. And, who's going to pay for insurance? And, there's a lot of logistics of life that you have to think about in these moments. And so we did try to think about as many of those possible. And the coach prompts you. They're like, have you thought about this? What about this? And so it did force us to look much farther out than I think either of us would have done naturally. But in doing that, we really did, for the most part, follow the parenting plan and the decisions we had made with some maybe minor tweaks, but it really did guide us along the way. And I know I'm proud to say that my ex-husband and I both moved Grace into her freshman year dorm 2 years ago together. That's something, she shouldn't have to choose which parent is there with her to help her in that moment. And, we can kind of look back and say, we co-parented her, across 2 households for those 11 years, but I feel like we did the best we could given the circumstances.
Yeah. We talk about it as like scaffolding, this plan, set up the scaffold, right? And maybe you're going to move some things, but at least you have the framework. Maybe that's the better word, more of the framework for your parenting. And those details you can never really think about, but they set you up for better success, right? And then being able to finally walk into the dorm room together. You don't think about that when she's 7.
No.
You make the right decisions and can plan and eliminate areas of conflict.
Yes.
You have the better outcome, better chance for success.
Agreed. And also having to have all of those discussions along the way, it did minimize the number of conversations we did have to have throughout her childhood of things that are pretty, the things you really have to sit down or reflect and discuss. And so they had been discussed. and then we could reflect on them and say, still makes sense? Yeah. Okay. And by the way, that then you just keep going, you live your life. And so I think it is an enabler for you to move on and live your lives as you choose to, but really, again, recognizing that you've brought this amazing child or children into the world, and they deserve to live the most normal life possible. And I think that's one of the things, Andrea, that I think that as couples, we make a commitment to our children when we bring them in this world, to live in the healthiest, happiest, safest, environment possible. And when we go through divorce, and even though we don't want to live in the same house, if we're not careful, the toxicity that can come from a divorce can have such a long-term impact on children's approach to relationships, their view on marriage, and their overall, happiness in life. And so, I think it's our responsibility, to really take that seriously. I joke that we cover the plugs, we put bike helmets on them, we feed them organic milk. We do all these things to make them healthy and happy. But then if we let them stay in that toxic environment, it's going to have long-term negative impacts. So I think it's up to us to take co-parenting seriously, to understand it's not about us, it's about our kids, and to really try to set aside our emotions. Again, it takes a lot of effort. It takes those muscles I talked about. It means taking the high road sometimes when the high road is really steep.
A lot of times. I mean, take the high road.
Right? But if you do that, at the end of the day, I think you can look back and at least say, hey, I did the best thing for my children in this really challenging time. And they can hopefully look back and say, yeah, my parents are divorced, but I had a really great childhood, which is what I hope that Grace could reflect back on at this point.
And having a great childhood and having that sense of family. We say here that we help couples end their marriages without destroying their families, because if you're not careful, if the attorneys are not careful, that's what you're setting your clients up for. A destructive relationship, a destructive marriage. Their kids are going to suffer. Their kids are going to suffer. It's a generational trauma.
It is. It's a great point. And it's the moments through a child's life where you can either not make it a trauma, or you can reinforce the trauma. And one of the moments we had that really stuck out for me is, and Grace was in 6th grade, and we were going into a parent-teacher conference. And so we were 5 years post-divorce. And we walk in, and my ex-husband and I, and Grace attends these in the middle school. They did that. So we sat down, we went through this whole hour of conversation about Grace's education and how she's doing in school. And the teacher stopped me at the end of the hour and goes, wait a minute, are you two divorced? And I said, oh yeah, we've been divorced for 5 years. She said, I had no idea. And I looked at her and said, well, it didn't occur to me to walk in and say, hi, we're here for Grace's parent-teacher conference, and we're divorced. So I said, why would we? And she said, you would be shocked at how few parents that are divorced can come into this office with their child and sit down for 1 hour and have a conversation about their child's education. She said, it is very, very rare. And she said, it really makes me sad.
Yes.
Right? And I said to her, that makes me really sad too. By the way, Grace is hearing this entire conversation. Okay?
Right.
I said, that makes me sad, because what's more important to two parents than how their child is doing in school?
Right. If you can be on the same page for that, you can just imagine the people fighting and bickering over their child's head. I can just visualize, or turning away or making eye rolls. You can just imagine what that teacher had to deal with some.
Right. Or they won't. Or by the way, they won't even do that. So the child has to go through 2 parent-teacher conferences.
Right. There.
And so does the parent, and so does the teacher.
Right.
Exactly. Many of the times they won't even sit in the same room to do the eye rolls,
or they're waiting for someone to arrive and he never shows up, or she never. All
of that. So it's just but those are moments, and I guess my point is those are moments when you can either reinforce that you're divorced, this is an issue, or you can come in and say, we're Grace's parents. How's she doing in school? Let's talk about that.
How can we help? How are we doing? How is she? Yep. So there's a whole concept of a good divorce, a better divorce. What can society know to appreciate that this is possible, this is attainable? What do you want people to know? Because your book, I just want to say one thing before you answer that question. Your book is wonderful in that it lays out so many things that in very short sections. You just hit everything. I mean, it's as if you've been through this many times. I'm amazed at how much you covered in your book. So I just want to plug the book for a moment. Just say, if anyone's in the middle or starting a divorce, you should pick up this book, mom or dad, doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah.
I think anyone would appreciate it, because you really go through all of these things in such a clear way. And someone who's been there. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I appreciate it. It is just a quick reflection on the book. It is set up in phases, right? Preparing for the change, during the change, and post the change, in bite-sized pieces. There's 185 topics, and the table of contents is set up with one topic per page. So if you only want to read one topic and reflect on it and think about what that means to you, it's not meant to be read cover to cover. It's meant to be something that you can pick up when you need it and think through those topics that you need to think through at the time. So thank you for that. But, going back to your point on society, I mean, a couple things. First of all, no one gets married to get divorced, right? It's not like we grow up and say, well, when I get divorced, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And generally, no one gets divorced for positive reasons. Something has triggered it, And children don't get to make the decision that their parents are going to get divorced. So when you think about society has a very clear mental model that divorces are negative and bitter and everyone's at their throats. And, and again, there are going to be those divorces where, for clear reasons, people can't be in the same room, right? And I totally appreciate there are those scenarios. There's others where you can and you could take a different approach. And I would love for society and societal perception to be that a good divorce is possible. It's an attainable outcome. I've had people come to me at different points and hear about my book or hear the term good divorce, and they're skeptical. They're like, really, a good divorce? And then other people say, I know one other couple that's had a good divorce. And I always say, oh, it's great, one other couple, but wouldn't it be great if a majority of society knew lots of couples that had good divorces? If you have to get a divorce, why not make it the best it can be, so that you can all go on and live happy, healthy lives in the next phase? Why is it that everyone is like, oh no, they had a bitter divorce, it was ugly? You hear that more often. And it's just unfortunate. I don't think it has to be that way, but it's going to take one divorce at a time, right? And couples individually making the decision that there's a different way to do this, for us to end up over the course of time changing societal perception, changing the picture of what divorce means for those that have to go through it. And so that's really, teaching. I wrote the book to share guidance and fairness, and to really just give back to women, but also I agree, men can benefit from the book as well. But I think at this point, I'm really wanting to help society understand that the concept of good divorce is an attainable outcome, but there's steps you have to take. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not easy, but it is doable.
It is doable, and I appreciate how that your goal was to just educate others so that they have this opportunity, to have a better divorce and to have a better life for themselves and their children. And it is one at a time, and that's what we do here too. One family at a time, helping them divorce better and healthier way, and hopefully there's more people will see it's possible. And let's help people focus on where they want to be, on their future, right? And not always look to the past, because those bad divorces, bitter divorces, are so focused on what happened in the past.
Yes.
And if you can shift the focus, you can shift your life.
You can absolutely. No, absolutely. And you know what? It's a really important point, and one just to reflect on for one sec, is those individuals that choose to continue to bring the past up, and that's what your children then start to model, right? It's about what happened in the past versus looking forward. And as I said, divorce is an action. You get divorced, but it shouldn't be this negative cloud that follows you and your children for your lives. There's a whole life out there that doesn't have to have that cloud, over you. And it's also, societally, there's a bit of a scarlet letter, on being divorced. There's still very much a label of, oh, she's divorced, or oh, he's divorced. And I said, it's unfortunate. I mean, I think you and I joked when we talked earlier that, I went to the dentist recently. I've moved to San Francisco in the last year and a half, and I went to the dentist, and there was, status, and it said single, married, divorced, and other. And I'm like, why? You're cleaning my teeth. Why does it matter that I'm divorced? It doesn't matter. But I mean, that's just, again, society needing to know what label to put on you. And so I would just like us to be able to shift, if that label is with you, that you can say, yeah, I'm divorced. I'm happy. My daughter's happy. My ex-husband's happy. I'm living an amazing life. And, I did have someone tell me at one point that I made divorce look too good. And I said, you know what? I'm just trying to live a happy life. I didn't apologize. I just kind of was marveled at the comment. But that's, that's an interesting thing, because it's like, oh, that looks too good. No, it means that I'm really just moving on. I want to live an amazing life. And yes, I've been divorced, but there's so much life to live.
Your marriage ended, that's all that's happened, and it doesn't have to define your whole life. And it's so sad that people think that. But
Yeah.
So your book has, I think you said 185? I didn't count.
185 topics.
185 topics. Okay.
Yeah.
Of how to have a good divorce. But I need you to pick one better divorce tip. So of all of those, or another one, what would you say is your one better divorce tip?
I think I'm going to go back. I really think we started with it. The mindset that you approach this with will define everything. And again, there will be days when that mindset is tough to keep. So I don't think you can always keep the strong, positive, this is all going to be okay mindset. There are days that are tough. And that's both okay and it's a reality. But where do you try to get back to? Where do you try to get back to, and where do you try to keep the environment for your children in that healthy, positive, forward-looking space? And so I would really come back to that. It's where I start in the book about mindset being essential. And I really fundamentally believe if you can start there, then a lot of things that I talk about in the book, the logistics of life and all the topics you have to think through, you're working from that base.
I love it. I couldn't agree any more than that. I mean, I absolutely agree. So thank you, Sarah. This was wonderful. I'm so glad you were able to join me on this podcast. It was really great having you here today. Tell us, what's the best way for people to find you and buy your book and find out more about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed our discussion. So you can find my book on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble. It's available actually in paperback, an ebook, iBook, Kindle combination. And also I went into the studio and did an audiobook. So it's available on Audible, because I do appreciate that, people might not want to have it on their bedside if they're thinking through things, or have their kids see it, and that's understandable. So whichever format that you need. And I also have a website, www.gooddivorce.guide, where you can contact me and learn more about the background in the book and anything else you might need to know about the concept of a good divorce.
Okay. I listened to the audiobook myself, and you did a great job. I have to say.
Thank you.
You're a very professional speaker, and I was just thinking, how much work did this take?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's so. I will say, just a quick reflection, that when you have to hear yourself speak in that way, there were a lot of what they call pickup sessions where we tweak things. But yeah, it's a really interesting learning process to do an audiobook and what that entails. But I felt, I wanted to kind of have that experience and see what that was like, and it was fun to do. But it is a bit of an intense process to get it end to end in a clean read that you're feeling good about.
Well, I think it's also great for somebody who needs privacy about what they're absorbing, the content they're taking in. I think the audiobook idea is great, especially for this, for the people who are listening to this podcast. So,
yeah, and I think go on a walk and listen to a couple of topics, and then maybe pause and reflect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. Great to have you here. And for everybody listening, this has been another episode of A Better Divorce podcast. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.
You've been tuning in to another episode of A Better Divorce podcast with Andrea Vacca. Thank you for subscribing, leaving your positive comments and reviews, and sharing the show with others. You can watch episodes at vaccalaw.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can listen through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Bye for now, and remember, you can have a better divorce.